of the presentation, and we now have the notice that it's being recorded. Thanks very much, Karen and/or Ron. So we're in charge of that. So I'll call a meeting to order, and just as a reminder to folks, this is a special board meeting to deal with the budget, and special board meetings by its nature are one topic only. We follow the same format of having the information presented, trustees able to ask questions as they go, and we have a public question period at the end. And so I'd first like to say thank you all for attending and acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the shared territory of the Qualicum and Tsawwassen First Nations, and we thank them for their careful stewardship of these lands over time. Themes is first on our agenda for Ron to deal with from February and March, then the grant announcement, then pressures and responses, and then public question period for those of you who don't have the agenda in front of you. So I will turn it over to Ron.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Chair Flynn. Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to quickly start sharing my screen at this point, then you can kind of see what the agenda is as outlined by the chair. Give me a nod that you've got it. Okay, so here we are again. We've had sessions in February. We've had sessions in March, I think, no, mostly February. We awaited the funding announcement in March, and then we follow up with we follow it up with other meetings in April, kind of thing. And so that's sort of the routine that we do. If some of you are familiar, I often show a graphics in terms of where we are in the cycle, and again, recognizing that our planning year starts in about January preceding the school year. So again, this is where we're at. And it starts with the enrollments, it starts with the staffing projections, and then it feeds into obviously the funding announcement, and then feeds further into obviously what we're dealing with today in terms of the actual finalizing of the budget for submission to the board next Tuesday, as our first sort of wonder in terms of, again, for the board to pass a motion to accept for it to it needs to go into the ministry by the end of June, so there is some time for the board to obviously deliberate over the information. Certainly they don't need to make a decision in April, but again, recognizing that we generally give it to them in April so that they can follow up with any questions that might be pertinent. So as indicated, themes from the sessions and surveys that we held in February and this month in April. Grant announcement, we'll talk about what it means to us and how it's going to impact us in terms of the establishing the budget. I'll lay out some of the budget pressures that obviously come from the announcement, but also are obviously coming based on economic and other drivers that we've talked about in the past, and then presenting a scenario of a budget response in terms of how to address the shortfall in funding, as it were. So I'll carry on.
Yep.
So the theme, and to Chair Flynn's point, absolutely, raise your hand, put it in the chat. Superintendent Jory and obviously Chair Flynn can monitor the chats and interrupt as necessary, so that if there's any questions, don't hesitate to ask at the time. So some of the themes from the 2023-24 survey that was conducted, and we heard from about 116 respondents, mostly parents. It gives them a good opportunity to feed their thoughts into the budget deliberations and budget process, and because we've often heard that they can't make it to the meetings and that kind of thing. And so it does lend itself to hearing from those that wouldn't otherwise be heard or couldn't otherwise be heard. So about predominantly parents, but obviously we also hear from teachers, support staff, administrators, and community members, to be honest. Oftentimes, if they don't have a child in the education system, it's a means for them to weigh in terms of on some of those questions that we ask. So some of the common themes that we've heard in the past, and again, recognizing that they are threading through to the current survey response, mental health and emotional well-being. Clearly, that's something it was there before COVID. Um, it was accentuated during COVID, and then obviously we're dealing with some of the after effects of COVID and the pandemic that it had on the kids within our system. And so we continue to deal with the mental health and emotional well-being um, as a support. And again, that's certainly coming through in the surveys. Likewise on the surveys, and again, part of this is because of the new student and family affordability fund that was created this year, but more emphasis on food programs. And I think that's obviously a current topic in terms of the minds of families that are out there that certainly struggle with the current economic reality of the inflationary factor of the food and the cost of groceries and that sort of thing. So again, recognition that there is a want for more supports with the food program. Likewise, sort of raising its head this year more than any other year was the lack of bus drivers or the bus driver supply. We talked about a lot of retirements in the system for bus drivers. Our spare bus drivers are certainly we're losing the pool that we used to draw on. And so we've actually had to cancel routes, as many parents know out there, cancel routes for the first time this year in many years. And again, it's recognizing that there is a lack of bus driver supply, and the want is obviously for more. What can they do to help? What can parents, teachers, support staff do to help to support replenishing that supply? The other thing, and again, we've heard this before in terms of the technology, the impact of technology is increasing in how we deliver our curriculum, how we deliver to students to prepare them for the future. But again, it's coming from the lens of equity of access to the technology we have, and also obviously some comments out there are basically about finding the balance. When is too much tech? When is technology enough, kind of thing? When is it too much in terms of the delivery and the impact that it has on families and providing some of these things? So again, it's about finding the balance of technology in our system and what we can, as a system, support going forward in terms of the number of desktop units, the number of iPads or tablets that we have out there. How many is enough out there that we can support the refresh cycle? Communication, again, that's been a theme for a number of years. And again, specifically what the surveys were kind of commenting on, better communication when a bus is canceled. And again, we get that. And we're going to try to address that in some of our other asks later on. But again, it's recognizing that we've always seen a wonder on the web presence, on our media, our how we advertise our good news stories, kind of thing. So there's always been that wonder from parents and staff in terms of how we communicate that out. And so by now it's sort of the extension of how do we communicate the services that were offered immediately, i.e. a bus cancellation and the impact it might have on a family the night before or the morning of. And sustainability obviously continues to be a theme. Green initiative, stewardship learning, how to embed that in curriculum, and oftentimes that is being driven by the ministry anyways. And so clearly you'll see obviously in many of the courses that your children are taking that stewardship is embedded in the work that the teacher is doing with the kids. And by extension of that, we've heard the outdoor learning opportunities. It sort of it kind of hit a high point, if you want, during the pandemic as teachers were asking to get outside and being able to teach in the fresh air. And then the creation, obviously, from the demand for the creation of outdoor learning opportunities, whether they're a infrastructure, i.e. we've got in a couple of sites, we've got these pads that are roofed. They almost look like a picnic area, but again, what they're about is an outdoor learning space for kids to do their artwork outside, for a class to be delivered outside, that kind of thing. So there's, again, recognizing that there's an increased want for those areas. So that tends to be the themes that we've heard. And what I try to do is I weave those themes into recognizing that some of these things align with what we want to do, or they align with what the province wants to do through the ministry. And sometimes if we can get to them, we do. And I'll try to weave that into kind of some of the asks that we have. Not everything is possible. We know that it's a balancing act in terms of what we want to do versus what we can do with the funds. But as best we can, we try to address some of these themes that we see coming from parents, teachers, staff, support staff, and administrators. So the operating grant announcement. So I'm trying to sum it up as easy as I can in terms of, because when I actually deliver the budget, I'll address kind of how much we got out of it. But when it comes to the operating grant itself, we don't get necessarily dollar for dollar in terms of our pro rata of what the grant announcement is talking about, in terms of we are about 1% of the provincial population, give or take. But it doesn't always work out that we get 1% of the grant announcements or 1% of the windfall. Obviously, growing districts will receive more, shrinking districts like ourselves, or declining districts like ourselves, won't get the full value of any of these enrollment growths. So the operating grant itself was a good news item when it was communicated out to the media, et cetera. It amounted to about a 9.4% increase in the operating grant year over year. And that amounted to about a $614 million investment into public education, bringing up the total envelope, or the total ministry budget, to about 6.6 billion. What that 9.4% increase covers is the wage lifts negotiated provincially for last year. So it amounted to about a 3.24 wage lift in 22-23, July 1, 22. It came into effect. July 1, 2023 is another 5.5% increase. And then there's about 0.9 added to the provincial grants for enrollment growth. And oftentimes they remark that they continue to fund growth. And what that means, or what they're meaning by that, is that using $6 million or 6.6 as a total budget, they have at times, even though maybe the provincial average, or the provincial enrollment went up by 1,000 students, for example, at times in years past, they maintain the budget at 6.6 billion as an example. So by them funding the enrollment growth, it means that they will increase that envelope. 6.6 is what they've increased it to accommodate new students in the system. And therefore, they're not the pie isn't shrinking, as it were. The pie is expanding as the student population is expanding. So again, it's a good news in terms of, in those school districts that are growing, that they will fully fund the number of students that they receive over and above the prior year. But again, it's obviously recognizing that for districts that are diminishing, obviously, they will obviously remove grants based on the per pupil accounting. And again, so I'll lead into that a little bit more when I talk about the actual revenues. What this effectively means is that there are no new increases for replacement cost pressures. School districts are being asked to find those budget items within their existing funding. And so we've talked about this over the last couple of years in terms of our replacement cost pressures are going up by about $300,000, and we have to find it within our grant. Same thing with the inflationary pressures on supplies and services, same thing. There is no new money for those areas. So again, what we're having to do is find it within our operating grant, and to continue to support, obviously, district supply accounts, district service accounts, school supply accounts, and those sorts of things, recognizing that we're having to stretch the money. It's not going as far as it used to effectively. Likewise, so not not really for discussion again, because it's going to be funded, is the COLA increase. So recently announced with the provincial bargaining at both tables, the support staff table as well as the teacher table, they negotiated the rates to be 5.5 starting July 1, 2023, with a COLA adjustment up to 1.25, subject to the actual CPI provincially, or the consumer price index. So the consumer price index was actually 7.1, so 6.75 becomes the new increase for grids. So the 5.5 is embedded in the funding announcement that we've received. The 1.25, once we get the grid increases, the impact on the grids, et cetera, then we'll receive the funding, but it won't be embedded in, or it's not anticipated to be embedded in the budget documents that I prepare for the board. Likewise, the other unanswered question, if you want, is we haven't received any word on the exempt grid adjustments. We know they're going up. We just don't know whether or not the province is going to fund them this time. They funded last year's at 3.24, and which was a good thing, because in the past they've expected boards to cover off any increases themselves. But recognizing that in the past, where we were maybe in a mandate of 2, 2, and 2, it was not a large value, if you want, or not as large a value for the board to have to find those shortfalls themselves. So it's kind of uncharted territory, which is why they did fund the first 3.24, and we'll see if they in fact fund the next 5.5 plus 1.25. So hopefully we'll hear that information before the end of the year. Again, likely it won't be heard before we've done deliberating over the budget. But again, what the ministry expects is you can't put in the budget any revenues that haven't been announced effectively. So only those revenues that have been announced will be included in the budget's documents. Also comes with a grant announcement, of course, is the information about special purpose grants. These are grants that that come, as the name implies, for a specific purpose. They come with rules of engagement kind of thing in terms of what we can use them for. Going back to this Student, Family, and Affordability Fund, it came with the caveat of being used for fees, field trips, and food programs. And so those three areas we were able to address with that funding. It was one time only, so it doesn't continue on into 23-24. But what they've done to address the food program, the food element, is they've added a three-year program effectively for Feeding Futures Fund, and for us it's about $520,000. All told, it's about getting my numbers right, $210,000, or about $70,000 a year. Sorry, $70 million a year. So it's a 3-year investment. At least then we know the program can be is going to be around for 3 years, unlike the Affordability Fund, which was a one-time only funding that was used to address certain things at the school level. Sorry, Trustee Austin, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, would you prefer me to wait to the end to ask questions, or would you prefer it as we go?
Not at all. If it pertains to something I can come back to, or absolutely.
Oh, okay. On the previous slide, and you were mentioning there at the end that we haven't had confirmation whether the province is going to cover the 5.5% wage lift.
That's for
And,
exempt
yeah.
staff. Yes, for exempt staff. That's
Oh,
correct.
okay. How much would that come to for our district if we did have to cover it?
You'll see it later in the slides, but
Okay.
you'll see it later in the slides. But what it amounts to is about 340,000. Okay.
Oh, it does. Okay. Well, then maybe I'll wait then until later in the slides because I have another question, but you may address it.
Okay,
Thanks.
fair enough. Right. So special purpose grants, like I said, the Feeding Futures Fund, again, It aligns with things that we're doing currently in the system, as well as obviously it'll support the provincial initiative of helping families, building programs, building food programs with the understanding that it's 3 years worth of funding. It's so when we got the affordability fund, it was about $410,000, but it was parceled out into 3 different areas. And so districts had the discretion of how they parceled it out. And so it was basically a third, a third, a third, we'll just call it. So what this Feeding Futures Fund means that whereas the food program that we were able to deliver with the affordability fund might have been about $150,000 district-wide, this is 3 times that, sorry, 3.5 times that. So it's a big amount of money that's going to be able to support some of the feeding programs or food programs that we have out there. They haven't sent specific guidelines, but certainly the anticipation is that the majority of the money is going to food. But they do recognize that staffing will need to be included. So they're going to this time allow for staffing to be embedded in that. They haven't necessarily said how much, but again, they kind of gave a rule of thumb of 1 staff member per district. I'm not sure how that resonates for a place like Surrey, but be that as it may, that's kind of the rule of thumb that I've kind of taken to in creating the budget. And likewise, equipment will be able to get purchased through this fund also, obviously recognizing that for 3 years, because it's been guaranteed for 3 years, and obviously we can build up and use some of the funding to build up equipment that's necessary to deliver some of these programs. The other good news that came from the budget was the annual facility grant was increased. So I've talked and trustees actually have spoken to the ministry about the fact that the AFG, which is a fund for local capital projects generally below the $500,000 mark that we've got to find money for ourselves. It often includes patching of parking lots, painting of buildings, DDC adjustments, the carpentry that we do at sites and that kind of stuff. But again, smaller capital projects that we can take on ourselves that basically refresh the sites that we have, not necessarily extend the life, but certainly refresh the facilities we got. So they've added funding to it anyways. And what it amounts to for us, generally we get about $1 million annually in this fund. This year we're going to get about 1.225 as it were, so about $225,000 additional funding to support the work that operations and maintenance do on our facilities. Also embedded in the special purpose funds are 3 programs that are provincial that we receive certain amounts from. So the Classroom Enhancement Fund, which was a fund established as a result of the Supreme Court overturning the class size and restoring the class sizes. And so it has wage slash staff implications. So what they've been able to do is add value to it by recognizing that those staffing costs are increasing due to the wage lifts, and therefore they're adding value to these 3 areas that have staffing implications. So the Learning Improvement Fund is a support staff driven fund that was negotiated through provincial bargaining with the support staff to add value or to add staffing time to the EAs and to be involved in some of the school planning activities. And then the Community Link Fund also has some wage lifts attached to it. And again, this is a fund that comes to districts to support vulnerable students, to support as needed students in terms of addressing some of those concerns that couldn't otherwise be addressed through special education funding. So those 3 items as a result of those 3 funds as a result got some small got proportionate increases for the 5.25 or 5.5% for wage lifts. So as I talked about, we start as early as January, February when we start looking at the projections. the enrollment projections. And so we look at the numbers in our school as of January, and then look at it again as of February, kind of thing, the current enrollment. We take information from Beauregard Demographics. You've heard us talk about that software supplier that allows us to project out many years, up to 15 years kind of thing, to see where we're going based on the information that they're receiving. And so it includes birth rate, it includes what we call retention rates, which is the number of kids in a population that come to our schools, as opposed to whether they go to a private school or they go to DL in another district. So again, so it includes birth rates, retention, and net losses that often happens too for community students that are going to other schools in the district, but not coming to their catchment school. So again, it takes that data, we compare that to our whites of their eyes data from January and February. We have a conversation with our principals in terms of what are they seeing? Are they getting a lot? Are they getting asked for tours of the school, that kind of nature? So with that, we kind of get a lens in terms of what are we willing to project out. And we tend to be conservative naturally, because we don't want to be caught off guard come September when we have to pull back staffing because the kids aren't there. So what you're looking at is obviously a 7 years past, including the current year, and 3 years forward. And so I'm kind of pointing to this in we've kind of had to reset the last couple of years, highlighting the as we went into the pandemic. Naturally, we lost kids in our bricks and mortar schools, which is the blue area, and we gained kids in the DL, which is the green area. And so as we came out of COVID, it kind of reset itself. These two programs, which is the red being the alternate program and the green being the DL program, generally speaking, our blue line tends to go up. And that's what you're kind of seeing. That's the kids that's the bricks and mortar schools. That's the kids in our regular programming, including French immersion. What we've been seeing since the pandemic is obviously kids are feeling safe and confident to go back into the schools through the alternate school as well as the DL program. They're coming back into our into the regular programming, and so that's why you're kind of seeing a bigger bump this year, with these ones declining. And again, hopefully you can see my cursor okay. What we had to do this year and last was this dip down is us having to recover overall the number of kids we have in a system. So again, we reached a high during the pandemic, as it were, because we had quite a few kids in our DL program from our own district, as well as we actually had kids coming across from other districts into our DL program. And so we actually hit a high at that point overall. And then since that time, we've been kind of coming down and resetting overall. And so the implication is that probably we've got another year of reset, which is why we're projecting about a 30 net decline, with a back to, if you want, back to our normal smaller increases after that. We're not growing in leaps and bounds. Certainly people are coming in, and so we have a net migration in, as well as smaller graduating class than what it used to be. We talk about the differential between the graduating class and the incoming kindergarten class as one observable in terms of projections. And so if you've got a graduating class of 600, for example, and you've got 400 kids coming in into kindergarten, then you've got to find at least 200 kids as a net migration in the other classes to cover off that loss. And so over the course of time, as the graduating class gets smaller, and our disproportionately smaller to our decrease at the K level, what you see is that the net migration doesn't have to be as large to cover off that differential. And so it doesn't take much for us to now see some migration in to be able to realize maybe 30 kids is a conservative in a year's time. But in the meantime, we've got to get over next year as we reset our DL program and alternate program, and of course our regular programming. The implications of that, of course, is revenues and the grant itself, because our 95% of our grant is generated on per pupil basis. It means there's a direct implication, obviously, of when we lose 30 kids, it means we'll lose that equivalent in funding. Leading into the cost and revenue items. So as I talked about the revenue loss, and so this is a direct correlation. This is a 30 FTE decline. At about 8,200 per FTE is about $270,000 operating loss that we have to absorb because those fundings won't come to us. When districts are rising, you will so in a school district like Soup, which has been increasing over the course of time, for them, if they were to gain 30 kids, they wouldn't necessarily have to add $270,000 worth of services. They would probably add a classroom teacher. They may add some additional time for clerical to support those 30 kids if they're in a single school. But generally speaking, when a district is rising in FTE, they don't have to spend the equal amount of funding as fast. And so oftentimes after 3 or 4 years, they'll add a clerical or they'll add some EAs, this kind of thing. But in the meantime, they're only really adding supports for the classroom teacher. When you're declining, the grant is lost immediately. And so so when you lose 30 kids worth of FTE and directly funded kids or directed funds of 270, you have to find the services now because it's not as easy as just removing one teacher from the system. One teacher, if in fact those 30 kids left a single school, that's fair. But generally speaking, those 30 kids are felt across all our schools, maybe 5 here, 7 there, 6 there, and it doesn't always equate to a 1-for-1 teacher. And then likewise, beyond the cost of the teacher, you obviously have to find another, if an average cost of a teacher is 140, then we've got to find another $130,000 in services. And so declining districts have a harder time keeping up with the funding loss versus when you're increasing. Growth districts have an easier time in terms of producing a surplus or being able to find funding for other services unrelated to the increase in the students. Hope I didn't lose you on all that, but suffice to say, it's harder for us in declining times than it is for growth areas. Answering Trustee Austin's question, $340,000 in exempt grid adjustments that if they're not funded, we've got to find them. So we're sort of setting ourselves up that we've got to find them within our budgetary discussions. So about 340 there, 270 in the loss, in the grant decline. Software licenses have been going up in the last couple of years. We kind of got a free ride during the pandemic when it came to the introduction to Zoom, the introduction to Skype, the introduction to Microsoft Teams. And then since that time, the software vendors have kind of said enough is enough. And as a result, they're starting to increase our licensing costs. And so what you're seeing is obviously the impact of Microsoft, the impact of Skype, the impact of Zoom, the impact of some of the other software that we are now using to deliver curriculum, to deliver administrative resources, i.e. report card writing and that kind of stuff. You're hearing Director of Instruction Terpstra and Principal Rowland talk about new services that they're delivering. They're coming with a cost and therefore coming with additional licensing costs, something that we've got to address. Pressure's ongoing, and I started again. We recognize that last year the replacement costs hit us hard. In 21-22, so the end of last year, our replacement costs increased by about $360,000. We had to sort of do a turnaround budget going into 22-23 and recover, sorry, not just recover, but cover those costs within our existing year. So within the current year, we had to find $360,000 of replacement cost budget items that comes from other things. Because it's not funded, because it comes from the operating fund, we basically just have to find other areas to deliver those replacement budgets. Same thing happened in utilities. Last year, we talked about the utility costs going up, driven by the Ukraine, Russian-Ukraine invasion, driving up the natural gas prices, driving up our utility costs. And so naturally, we had to bear about a $200,000 increase.
Ron,
Yes.
could you toggle the little button down at the bottom and make this about half again as large? Again, I'm getting a bit of a headache, and I was
I
like,
got you.
remember, oh
This-
yeah, bigger
yeah,
font,
that-
please, and on behalf of everybody, thank you.
Is that good?
Yeah, much better,
We
thank
might
you.
be able to go one more. There you go. Okay. Right. And so these two areas, utilities and replacement costs, we had to bear the brunt this year in our 22-23 budget year. So on the plus side, we had, we were able to obviously we were able to put money in on account of increased enrollment. And so we were able to address it in a single year. Benefits is another cost driver that's going to impact 23-24. And I'm showing you WCB, extended health benefits, dental benefits. For example, our WCB rates are going to up by about 38.6% alone. And it's driven by sectoral increases, i.e. Our wage rates are based on our sector that we're in. And this isn't just us, but all companies pay a price for the sector they're in. And in our case, it's K-12 education, as well as your user rates kind of thing, or as a company, how much we tap into being over or under the norm, or over or under the average for our sector. So it's being driven by a sectoral increase as well as an increase on account of our experience ourselves. So it's hitting about 38.6%. Extended health benefits that we don't have a lot of control over because they're provincially determined, provincially negotiated, are going up about 11.5%, and our dental rates are going up by about 2.2. Some of this again is a response to the pandemic. When you look at our usage rates, for example, in extended health and dental, in the year of the pandemic, both of those usage rates went down, and it was generally driven by the fact that we couldn't get in a dentist's office, we couldn't get in a doctor's office. And so what you're seeing now is 2 years later, as some of those medical issues have kind of carried on, it's driving up our usage and therefore driving up our rates. Everything's tied to the pandemic, unfortunately. Blame it on that. I kept this line item in there for the district and school supply accounts. It's really just to frame the fact that we've had to, over the course of the last couple of years, take away value from our school supply budgets and from our district supply budgets. So it's just a reminder of what we've given up in the past to balance our budget, because certain things aren't funded, and so we've got to find it from somewhere. Revenue items. So again, some of the good news items, obviously, is our rental rates. And so after the pandemic, our rentals have increased in terms of how much value that we're getting from our closed sites for rentals, as well as the understanding that because we're increasing our rental rates, that's driven by the market, we should see an increase in our revenues from rentals. Investment rentals revenue is truly driven by the interest rate increases that we're seeing, and so because we have certain liabilities that we have to hold on the books in our financial statements, we always have to have some net cash in there, and again, it's we put it into investment accounts, and those investment accounts, because the interest rates are rising, are now giving us an additional revenues. Some of the two areas that we kind of started to address in terms of what we can do to relieve some of the pressures, recognizing that the trustees elections are only held once every four years. a shout out from the trustees, I'm sure. So we can now take that out of the budget in terms of what we held for the costs to run the elections. We can take that back out and put it into something else. The zero waste initiative was value or dollars that we put into the zero waste program that is that we're funding in the district. And as it happens, it's now recoverable fully or 100% from the RDN. So it's felt that we can pull that value out of there because it's net zero, as it were, because RDN gives us dollar for dollar on how much we spend on it. So again, how you're reading this is obviously $800,000 in immediate pressures or potential costs. This page shows 285,000 in relief from that. So what it amounts to is about a $515,000 shortfall that we have to talk about a little bit. No hands, we'll carry on. So so the $550,000. So again, recognizing that there's various areas that we need to go to. There's new funds that we can find to support some of the work we're doing, and as well as ultimately because we're losing students by about 30, we're asking to find about 1 FTE teaching from the district staffing matrix, because it's obviously it's tied to students. We're asking to find 2.0 FTE worth of EAs in the system coming from the district staffing matrix. Likewise, we're looking to find some custodial replacement costs. And again, right now our custodial replacement costs are going up quite heavily. And again, part of it is because as a response to the pandemic, we've recognized the need for cleaning in our schools. And so we basically maintained, since the pandemic, we've maintained the same staffing ratios for custodials in our system, including the replacement on day one. But in the first year or two of the pandemic, it came with additional costs. And so we increased our staffing, but it came with federal funding. In the second and third year, now that we're into the third year kind of thing, we've maintained the staffing, and we're kind of recognizing that it's time we started backing off on that a little bit, knowing that there are no new funds for it. And so we've got to find that right balance of what the appropriate amount of custodial in our system. I've jumped around a little bit, but again, recognizing that there within the current year's budget, 22-23, there was a district support that was at the board office that was in the budget. The individual retired, and so we're just not going to replace that position, but absorb it within our current staffing matrix. Program supply budgets, again, we're looking to tighten how we deliver some of our programs and the services that are obviously that come with those. Looking to find about $110,000 in reviewing of the program needs. I've left these for last because again, these are coming from new funds, and so really the costs currently are in the operating fund, but with the new funding, it's allowing us to move the things that we're currently doing within the operating fund to continue to support those things, but is now being funded separately through the AFG increase that we saw, through the food program. We're looking at because we can allocate it up to a staff member for that. So I'm putting PW as a program worker, and again, whether it's a single program worker or made up of a series of EAs, program workers, youth and childcare workers, it really is just an earmark for shifting the value of 1 FTE into the food program. Same thing for the AFG. It's the value of about $200,000 shifting from the operating and maintenance costs from operating into the AFG funds, with the hope that we can eventually pay that back so that they can actually have a fulsome budget, which is obviously much needed, as the ministry recognized. ECL is the Early Care and Learning Grant that was given to us the middle of last year, or the middle of the current year. I tend to have an identity crisis when I do these budgets because I'm speaking to the next year when I'm still in the current year. But Early Care and Learning Grant that was that we applied for, received in about October, that we were able to use some administrative staffing for. because we're not going to use all of it this year. We're going to carry forward some of it as well as get our second year of the support. It's about 175 in total. And so we're indicating obviously that we can now support additional work from that administrator. So that's the potential response. And again, for the $515,000 shortfall, we're building a cushion. Again, the attempt here is to pay for some additional things that we've talked about in our budget deliberations in terms of being able to support ads, if you want. So we're building a cushion by saying 515 is what we needed to find. We found 840,000. It allows us to find about add about 325,000 of additional expense items, if that makes sense. So I threw this one in because I've shown it in the past in terms of just recognition of our staffing complements. Our teachers and again, so you're looking at about a 5, 10, 11, 12 years, I guess, of data coming from the blue being the teachers, red being support staff, and green being admin. So it's our principals and exempt staff. So remembering again, going back into the archives, enrollment declined over a period of years, leading to about 2013. And this district responded by closing 4 schools, rightly so, because as the enrollment declined, we were obviously having more and more empty seats. So as the burden of finding deficits, the response was to close schools, as many districts dealt with. So if my cursor is the enrollment line, it was declining during this period, which is obviously why the teacher complement was declining, which is why the support staff was declining over those years. And generally speaking, it kind of declined here as they, because they closed schools, they obviously didn't need as many principals. So that's what you're kind of seeing here. So this was the period in time where we had the least amount of student enrollment. Since that time, as you saw in my previous map, previous graph, we've been increasing by fits and starts kind of thing. And so in some years, we kind of gained 80 kids, and another year we gained 30 or 50 kids kind of thing. And so that's what we're doing to respond to that in many cases. So you would, so that's what you're seeing. And so it's inevitable that staffing will decrease, generally speaking, as we lose enrollment. And likewise, as we gain enrollment, if we can do so, we'll add back staffing appropriately. Also, and again, putting this into context, also recognizing that other funds become available to us over the course of time. So I talked about the Classroom Enhancement Fund. So as a result of the Supreme Court ruling, they added about, to our district, they added about $2.5 million to our funds to support additional staffing in our district. And it generally, as you can see here, went to teaching. And so that's what you're seeing. That's the implication of this, is we didn't increase by a great number of kids, but the program, the funds coming from the ministry allowed us to add about 25 FTE, which is what you're seeing here. The ebbs and flows are really just about how we are addressing some of the needs. Sometimes if we do have excess funds, which is what we kind of had that year, we are able to add it to our teaching staff. Likewise, over the course of time, we're adding support staff in various areas. Administratively, it ebbs and flows again with the funding. We've had health and safety funds come from BCPC. It meant we were able to add an exempt staff. Our ISP program grew during that period. It meant that we were able to add another funded position for principalship. That's the kind of thing that comes with the funds as they come to us. And so it's not meant to really tell too much of a story other than this is about where we are in terms of staffing. By default, this red line gets broken down into, I'm just going to move this up a little bit so you can see it. Gets broken down between EAs or educational assistants, clerical and library staff. O&M is our operations and maintenance, including custodial staff, and transport is our transportation department, which includes bus drivers, mechanics, and a dispatcher. So again, what you're seeing is over the course of time, as things come up, we can address it through additional staffing. And so again, what you're seeing here is that over the course of time, particularly in this year here, 1920, our CUPE staff, as the kids return to the district, we were able to add CUPE staff or custodial in this case, custodial staff to the schools to augment the more kids running around, the more staff that's running around, and to support them in that regard. Likewise, over the pandemic times, we added more value. And again, that's what you're seeing here is addressing it through staffing and custodial. Our EAs grew during the year after pandemic as we brought back, as the kids were coming back to us. Some of them, again, we were addressing it through the mental health funding, through emotional trauma-informed practices kind of thing. And we were able to add EAs to the system. This is just the ebbs and flows of our need to change based on grants and based on the funding shortfalls. And so again, we're addressing with time, but again, this is sort of meant to say that there's a lot of obviously moving parts to the budget development. Some of it is because of funding, some of it is because of identified need, whether it's through survey or through administrative need and wonders. But again, you can kind of see that some of these things are planned, some of them are just by design, that obviously these increases are going up. Trustee Curlin.
Yes. So when the when the line goes up there for the teaching staff, were those on permanent contracts or were they temporary?
It's a mix. So yeah. So I can't tell you the split. Maybe it's 90% continuing, 10% temporary, to allow fluctuation or to allow flex in the system for staffing purposes. But what you're seeing, the blue line, is all teachers embedded in the system.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And again, I'll reiterate that not all these funds are coming from, not all the staffing is coming from operating funds. So again, as the federal funds came forward during the pandemic, as the provincial response to the pandemic came in, we were able to address some of these things through staffing. If we didn't spend in the year, we addressed it likely the following year kind of thing, which is what we ended up doing last year by building a budget around an $800,000 deficit to allow us to obviously start giving back to the system after the pandemic. So, and again, so that was kind of to address why we sometimes feel the need, why we have to address it in the form of whether it's teacher staffing or EA staffing or custodial staffing or clerical staffing. We're obviously trying to share the burden, as it were, so it's not always coming from educational funding. Knowing that the percentages, it's about 75% of the funding goes to instructional and augmented services, and so oftentimes we're having to find the savings in other areas also. So moving forward, obviously the cushion that I talked about that we're trying to create, that we did create here, is about $325,000. And so what we're asking to do is, in response to the tech refresh, certainly it's been spoken about on a number of occasions, the very fact that we don't have the funds currently in the budget to do a proper refresh. Correct me forgive me if I don't have the right numbers, but again, if the normal refresh for devices is once every 5 to 10 years kind of thing, we need additional funding within our operating budget to support that kind of refresh rate. So that's what you're seeing as over and above what we currently have in there, which is called the Evergreen program, that's embedded in our budget. We're wanting to add another $100,000 to a $200,000 budget that's in there now. bringing it to 300. Also adding a refresh cycle for the rotors and the hubs that are required in the system of about $125,000 a year. We've talked about the white fleet. Currently in the budget, there is about $100,000 for the equipment replacement for O&M. Yellow fleet versus white fleet. The yellow fleet, which is the school buses, are funded from the ministry. So when the ministry when we send off our inventory of buses that are yellow, the ministry looks at it and says, okay, if they're greater than 12 years old or greater than 475,000 kilometers, they will come up for renewal. And so the ministry will give us funding for a replacement. We order the bus, we pay for the bus with the ministry's money, and then we recycle out and create potentially a spare, or we obviously sell off the old bus because it's got more miles and more years than we want on for active service. As far as the white fleet's concerned, though, we have to find the funds internally. The white fleet are the buses, are the vans that we use for programs, for outdoor ed programs. We've got an ISP white bus that runs our program, as well as our maintenance vehicles, vans, our carpenters, our painters. They all have a fleet of white vehicles that are purchased with operating dollars or local capital dollars if we happen to have them. But point being, we have to find the funds within our existing budget. So what we're asking to do is expand the program that's there now that has $100,000 in it and add another $100,000 so that our operations and maintenance department can get into a cycle of refreshing their units rather than just refreshing them when there's money available. So that will use up the 325 so that we can balance the budget and bring it in. A couple of other items that were identified in the budget deliberations. One was the transportation route software. This is the routing software that allow us to sort of build efficient routes within our busing system. It allow us to, and I think Director of Operations talked about a little bit more in terms of building better manifests, i.e. who's riding our buses. We introduced the Zonar program about 2 years ago that allows students to have a single fob that allows them to sign in, sign out on the buses. And again, what this will allow us to do with the routing software is obviously implement manifests so that we can not only know who's on our buses at any given point, i.e. let the administrators know who's on our bus at any given time and let parents know that we've got whose kids are on the bus. It'll also allow us to obviously communicate, and again, coming back to the survey of allowing us to communicate with the families affected by route cancellations. The software will allow us to better align with what we want to do to communicate the information directly to the parents and also to the staff, obviously at the school, so that they know who to expect and potentially who to inform if the information isn't getting them in any other way. But it does come with a cost, and so what we know is that one-time costs of $100,000 for the first year. There's anticipated another 100,000 for the second year as it gets up and going, and then ongoing maintenance costs. And the ongoing costs will just get embedded into our licensing software costs. But certainly we've got to find some funds for the software itself. And so we're kind of looking at not finding it of operating dollars, but sort of potentially using our local capital money. We've got about $111,000 still uncommitted that could help support some of this, as well as potentially future surpluses going forward. Part and parcel to this obviously is with the transportation routing software. One of the other revenue items that we're kind of wondering about is so that we can better understand who's riding our bus and who versus who has a bus pass for that bus. And so we're talking about in the background at Finance and Ops, we're talking about a application process for the bus passes to get a better understanding that some of the individuals that are applying for buses are applying on just in the event of maybe their student will need it, wanting to reserve a seat in the event of maybe their pickup and drop off not working out. And so again, with adding a one-time application fee, hopefully it'll better address, do I really need this pass or not, or can that seat be given to somebody else that really does require it? So that will generate some funds that will help offset this cost also. Again, it's not with the intention of paying for this, but it is recognizing that we need to do something differently with our transportation department, not only to address the supply of bus drivers, but obviously how we deliver the service to the community itself. The other item on here is the HR requests. And so again, this is an extension of the software that we bought 4 years ago now, the Atrieve software. And it's certainly as we've gotten comfortable with the Atrieve software, we didn't buy it. We didn't buy all of the modules that are available to us. And so we bought what we needed at the time based on the services that we were doing and we're trying to replace. And so over the course of time, as we've gotten familiar, as we've got comfortable with the software, we're recognizing that there's also a need for additional modules that can certainly enhance what we're doing in the HR department. And so it does come with a cost, one time mostly, of about $65,000, and then small licensing fees thereafter, about $5,000 thereafter. So those things again aren't going to be embedded in the 165 items, aren't going to be embedded in the in the budget documents, but it is how we're addressing a couple of other areas that were highlighted during the budget process. I'm just moving right along. So if any senior administrators want to weigh in on some of these things, if you provide, just thinking if you want to provide additional context in any areas, please do so, or just leave it as it is.
We have a question in the chat from Angel that folks can have a look at, and Dr. Jory and Associate Superintendent Wilson, do you want to tackle that question that Angel?
Do you want to go first, Jill? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Sorry, and I lost the chat because my
Oh.
Zoom kicked off for a moment, so I don't have the chat still in there.
Okay.
I think the question
read
was
it.
around.
I'll
I think-
read it.
okay.
I'll let you read it. While we acknowledge that and appreciate knowing ADST is supported by our board, and that corresponds, I believe, to exploratories, is supported by our board. It must, however, be properly funded. Can you please answer, will our board be funding ADST FTEs for our schools over regular school teaching FTE hours for 23-24 school year? And can you confirm for us, has the overall FTE for ADST district-wide been reduced at schools this year, or are there any reductions planned for next year? DPAC is hearing that this kind of learning and skills building opportunities are important to our families and kids.
So the short answer is yes, there's been some reductions in the FTE allocated to what we have known as ADST, recognizing that ADST happens all over the place in all kinds of different curriculum areas anyway. The staffing that we provided to schools to give as supplemental staffing that's always waited till the boards pass the budget has been reduced. It means that the classes for all of the what we call ADST time are not going to be as small as what they have been this current year, but it doesn't mean that they're not going to happen. We hear our teachers say the same thing, and we definitely hear our kids talk about the different opportunities that they have. We're asking for our teachers to align it with their curriculum and support it through providing those opportunities more than just the time that they have the 2 blocks or 2 sessions or whatever we want to call it, depending on which school we're at, as part of the ADST support time. But in short, yes, it has changed, and we've looked at putting funding in different places.
And I'll just chime in and remind everybody that we don't need additional staffing to do curriculum. ADST, hands-on learning, formerly known as exploratories, if you will, doesn't require extra staffing to do that type of teaching and learning. However, what we've heard is that our schools would like extra flexibility and some latitude around how they organize their kids so that they can do activities that they feel are a little bit more successful, a little maybe perhaps with a higher level of supervision or engagement or whatever it is they're doing. And so we tried very hard to keep as much as we could and put that back in. It has been considered like a bit of a luxury, as Ms. Wilson said. And this is a bit of a tighter year, so we are putting back in, but it is a slightly smaller allotment than this current year.
And if I may add, Chair, I did share at the Education Committee an example of how creative some of our schools are being around their use of their allocated time. We've had a really high number of families choose this STREAM program, which is a district program currently operating out of Qualicum Beach Elementary School. And so the administrator up there, the principal up there, Mr. Williams, has been able to offer 2 cohorts of STREAM without any additional staff. And so that is hands-on learning, working through all the curriculum with multi-age, it's grades 4, 5, 6, and 7s, working together. And so without additional staff, he's been able to create 2 cohorts. So again, just want to give you an example of what our teams do that recognize that we have different interests and different needs of learners, and they do get creative with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Wilson. Mr. Amos, do you want to sort of wrap it up and then we'll open it up?
I will, yes, thank you.
Yeah, and then we can.
Yep.
Make,
And then if there's any, certainly if there's any other comments, I mean, until we're actually off here, questions are still welcome. But just to wrap it up, recognizing that we always do the special board meeting the week before we deliver a budget to the board. It'll be the board's discretion whether or not they adopt the budget, but certainly the documents are being prepared based on what was shown tonight. And so we'll deliver budget documents to the board next week for deliberation, and then with the understanding that the mandatory submission to the ministry won't be until June 30th. There will be a couple of additional, again, so just recognizing that the document won't look like this per se. What I'll try to do when I do send it to the board is include some of the screens just to remind the board of how some of these things were articulated in the presentation, and then point to them in the documentation to sort of show how they're being presented in the budget itself.
yeah, where they are, because
Where they are, why we're doing what we're doing, and why it shows the way it is.
Yeah.
Other than that, that's the end of my presentation. I will take it off screen share, and then you can
And then-
carry on.
folks, if you could use the raise hand feature, because that pops you up on the top of the screen for me, and Trustee Austin.
Thanks for all that again, Ron. Every time I see it and hear it, I always think of something else. So it's good that we have an opportunity to see it so often. So I have a couple of questions. I'll just run through them and then maybe you can answer them at the end. I think it was slide 2 or perhaps 3. When you were talking about the wage list, and then you had said there were no increases for replacement cost pressures and no increases for inflationary pressures on supply and services. And then that would run $300,000 plus. Is that we would have to find that? And yet I didn't see that reflected later on when you were talking about some of the pressures. And then my other question is back to this wage list. I have to say I'm pretty perplexed at the provincial government that they seem to be waiting so long to let school districts know whether that exempted grid adjustment will be funded through the province. For us, it was $340,000. It's a pretty big chunk. And so I guess my question there is, if it turns out the province does fund that, where would we put that $340,000? Because that would be great. And then my other comment is around the $25 bus fee. I did mention this at the Fit and Ops, but I will. For me, it's worth mentioning again. The province is no longer having that one-time supplies grant that they gave to school districts to sort of alleviate some of those pressures on parents. So those pressures continue to be on parents at the beginning of the school year. There are supplies, school supplies they have to get, gym suit shoes, indoor and outdoor shoes. Sometimes there's a deposit on books, and there's all these upfront costs. And I just feel that this is one more pressure that we're putting onto our families that especially at this time, they don't need. So I would certainly lobby. I understand how it would be great for our budget, or help in our budget, but couldn't support putting that kind of pressure yet more on our family. And then my last question, and this may be something you'd rather address at finance and ops, and I'll leave that up to you, is I am wondering in our investment revenues of $100,000, just what is involved with our investments? Thank you.
I think it's just basically interest rates on the Canadian deposit account.
Yeah, I've got, so the 4 questions, absolutely. I'll address them one-offs. So I'm going to quickly screen share, and I'll point out, first of all, the exempt area of where we're showing it. So bear with me. So again, so to your point, no word on the exempt staff grid increases if they will be funded. So later on in the slide deck, I've got this one that talks about exempt grid adjustments of 340. So that means that if it's not funded, we have to find the funding. We have to find it within our operating budget. And so that's why it adds to the potential cost items or cost implications that isn't yet funded.
Yes, thank you, Ron. I understand that. My question was, if it is funded,
That was
What
your
would you do?
second question.
what would we do with the 340,000?
Right. So absolutely. So to your second question, why the delay? And what would we do if we did have the funding? It would basically be, again, we'll take it under advisement for the second amended budget kind of thing. The implications are that they likely are not going to let us know in the next month and a half. They don't appear to have any desire to let us know. What I've indicated in some of these report outs is that it will likely come from BCPC when the new grids are announced. And so when the July 1st, 2023 grids are presented to districts from BCPC, they'll give us the teachers, they'll give us the support staff, because it now has to recognize the COLA increase. When they give us those 2 grids, they'll also share with us the exempt staff grids, which is implied that they will also have a 5.5% increase, as well as the COLA adjustment on them. And then at the same time as them delivering the exempt staff grids, they will give us information on how we can deliver, and the rules, if you want, of how we deliver exempt staff increases. So we've talked about what, again, you as a trustee are familiar with the in-camera discussions that we have that comes from BCPC in terms of what we can and can't give in increases. What we shared with the board last year was that even though the grids increased higher than the inflationary, we weren't necessarily able to give the full value of the grid increases. So they give us the rules of what can and can't be of what we can deliver in terms of increases. We share that with the board. We ask for board approval on delivering those increases. And then basically we act upon that board motion, and then it would naturally get reflected. If it happened after the budget was delivered, it would be addressed at the new budget. In this case, because we know that the grids are going up at least 5.5, it's embedded into the 23-24 budget process. Where will the funds go? Again, that will be decided with September funding, along with the recalc funding, along with other grants that come to us. We'll create an amended budget in February, but in the meantime, we'll keep the board informed of any new funds that come forward and how we're addressing certain pressures come September. Where am I at? Application fee was your third question. I get that it's an impact on families. I understand that. This is really about us trying to address some of the review that naturally has to happen in our transportation department. And so one offset is so that we can, it's not just about a revenue generator, it's also about paying for the software to address the to address the routing. It also allows us to understand, and I use this example in finance and ops, so you'll remember, that in some cases our ridership is about 2,000, for example. So we have about 2,000 kids with cards in our system of 4,000 kids. And so what that means is 50% of our kids hold a bus pass. But when you look at a bus at any given point, they're not packed to the gills. They're not 3 per seat. They're running at like 50, 60, 70%. And that's not to say on some days that when it's colder or when it's wet, the ridership goes up. But again, it's better addressing how many kids truly are in our system and accessing our busing, because right now we don't know that. We have manifests because we know which kids have bus passes. We know what routes they're allowed to ride on, so we can deliver manifests. But on any given day, we don't know how many kids are actually on the bus. And so the routing software and the fees for the application will help support us knowing that better. And last question before
May I just add to that? I'm going to interrupt.
Sure, yeah.
Through the
please.
chair. So Trustee Austin, I think the revenue that it's going to generate is going to be nominal, but it will allow us to be much more accurate and much more efficient in our student count, and then be able to design a service that better meets the needs of our clients. So as much as there is a little bit of a cost pressure to parents, we're hoping that we can put a better product, a more organized product on the ground as a result of the improved accuracy. That's the strategy here. I don't know if it's going to work, but we are going to give it a go if we can.
And just to finish up, what Chair Flynn started to address, the investments, absolutely investments are coming from 2 sources. We have a certificate of deposit with the ministry, of which any excess funds are, if you want, given back on a temporary nature, are given back to the ministry. We get access to those funds within 10 days of notification. So it's a sort of a short-term deposit that they can give us very good rates on. They're better than the bank rates. And then the other half of our funding that we need access, obviously, for our liquidity issues in terms of paying for payrolls, paying for services, paying for capitals, that kind of stuff we keep with obviously the bank, and they give us the best rates that we can get on a savings type account. So that's the nature of our 2 investments. They're not tied up in any other long-term investments. They're not tied up in any kind of GICs. They are just tied up in either a ministry deposit system program or in our local bank.
It's the
Now
central-
I'm done. Now I'm done.
It's the central deposit program. It's not your BC investment program that's investing in, oil and gas and this type of thing. This is strictly cash on hand and interest rates provided, and we seek the higher interest rate that they will offer. So it's not through BCIMC, basically.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for that, Eve. You knew where I was going with that.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure, maybe I missed it, Ron, because there's so much information, but that $300,000+ that doesn't have an increase for replacement cost pressures and inflationary pressures for supplies and services. Was that addressed? This isn't the,
Sorry, no, bear with me. I'm just trying to find the sheet you're talking about.
it would have been slide.
I think you're referring,
2-3. Slide
sorry,
2-3,
this
I
one
think.
here.
It was right up early.
This one, replacement costs?
Is that what you're talking? There's not a figure there, and yet when you were talking about it on slide 2, I think, or 3, after it didn't have an amount attached to it. You just had the comment about that there's no increases for replacement and no increases for inflationary, and you said we have to find about $300,000 for these things. I'm just wondering.
So, okay, yeah, I think I know where you're going. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thanks.
I've got
Fair
two
enough.
items here. So I think what you're talking about is these lines here
Yes,
that talked about no increases for replacement cost pressures and no increases for inflationary pressures. And again, I answered the question as if it were this one, but no, you were talking about this one. And so what I'm kind of drawing attention to is the fact that in 21, 22, when we finished last year, I sort of honed our attention to two problem areas. One was, well, three, to be honest, utility is the same thing, but I sort of isolated three areas of worry, as it were. One was the replacement cost pressures. Part of it because obviously we talked about in terms of longer absences and more absences. Likewise, I talked about the increase of utility costs based on the supply and services inflationary pressures. So what I'm indicating here is that the current funding announcement didn't give us any new monies for these two things. Okay, so when I draw our attention to these two line items, the replacement costs and the utility costs, again, that would be the supply service inflationary costs. What I'm indicating here is that we found $360,000 within our own budget. The ministry didn't give us any new money to allow us to loosen those and put them back into staffing.
And it was from this year's budget.
And it came from the 22-23 budget year. So,
okay,
because it's all about, once we move the funding into these replacement costs to cover that shortfall, it doesn't come back to us until we either reduce our replacement costs or get funding over and above what we've found to recover that replacement cost increase. And so again, what I'm trying to do is say, we found $560,000 in our current year to fund these two budget items, because the budget items aren't taking care of themselves and the ministry's not taking care of it for us.
okay.
Is
Thank you very much, Ron. Yeah, I was trying to
Okay.
make those correlations between the two places. So, thank you.
So I'll go to trustee Young and then Superintendent Jory.
Okay, I just want to give a kind of a flavor for where I'm going with this. Everybody can hear me, right? Because my little thing's not lighting up. Aha, there it is. Thanks. First of all, I really, really, really appreciate all the work that has gone into what you see tonight and what you've seen over this whole time. I think we have an incredibly open process, and I just so appreciate the work that senior management does, the work that Ron does, the work that everybody does on this. This is not easy. In fact, it's really, really difficult. And then, no matter what we do, there's going to be people saying, yeah, but why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? So, we're always ready for that. A couple of things. First of all, already we've looked at the bus rationalization. We talked about that at Finance and Operations this week. And I would ask that DPAC do something at their meeting tomorrow night. And that is explain to parents, explain to the other PACs, especially the ones that use the bus a lot, what we're up to here. That it's not just, oh, we're going to slap $25 on you because we want to do that, but that there's a whole process. And maybe by educating, we can actually do some rationalization around that. The other thing is, today at the education committee meeting, we started talking about the equity of access to technology. So there's all of these pieces, and it's just amazing what's being done. Having said that, one of Ron's jobs is to be conservative, and he's probably naturally kind of, a little bit more conservative than some of us. I tend to be a risk taker. So I would like to kind of think, okay, well, we're going to get some more money. So let's do this or let's do that. And maybe we can leave some of these other things until later in the year when we got the money. Last time I did this, we were in the hole for, $800,000 at the end of the year because the money didn't come in. So maybe not a good strategy. I wonder, I'd like to see if we could do a little bit more digging around the WorkSafe, and we don't have to do that right now, but at some point looking at, why are our rates higher than average? And are there, and I guess I'm speaking facilities and ops, are there facilities and ops issues here? In other words, because our buildings are not the brand new buildings, that there are some issues here, okay? So that's one for later, but I would like to dig a bit into that, and I'll probably talk to Ron about maybe doing that at finance and ops. It's always easier to put in non-enrolling staff in September. So if we all of a sudden get 30 more kids, then it's always easier to add EAs, to add a non-enrolling teacher or whatever. So as much as we can, I'd like to see us do that. I don't want to decrease our educational staff, and I'm looking for ways around that. And finally, I wonder if our trustees might have an appetite for looking again at international ed and at the kind of the gentle cap that we put on international ed. I know that it takes staffing, and I know we won't be able to do it immediately, but we might be able to do it for January. And it's certainly something that I'd like trustees to think about. The other thing that always comes up, and this is around, what I've heard from the schools is exploratories, and the issue's already been raised very well by Angel. But an understanding, and I guess I'm going to ask Jillian or Peter to explain now what happens in terms of staffing. Who makes those decisions? How does the staffing come down? Because I think that that's a little piece that we could do some education around. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Trustee Young. I think taking risks is interesting, but we are conservative, so we can we can take that on at Fins and Ops, and I think the WorkSafe piece as well. I suspect it's not going to be one place. It's not one sector, part of our sector, or some work group, but they have injuries, sprains, strains, they're off. And that's where maybe our calculation tilts for us as a district versus the sector. We can't change the sector, but maybe the district. But I think Carol is our Trustee Kellogg is our trustee to the District Health and Safety Committee, and she could maybe carry that forward to them to help us understand a little bit more of that going forward. It's not something we can remedy now, and it's a people-based calculation as well. So other challenges, yes, you presented, interesting. And Superintendent Jory, a comeback.
Yeah, I've got a few little kind of things to, I guess, mention. First of all, in regard to fees, generally speaking, and this is for everyone, but specifically Trustee Austin, we're very reluctant to ask for more money from parents, recognizing the cost pressures. Even if they're small numbers, there's still a pressure. But it also requires us collecting that money. And that's a dynamic I don't enjoy for a school district. I don't want to be a place where people are looking at us like we're a collection agency and we're chasing them down. I want the dynamic to be much more positive and supportive than that. So it's anytime we enter into a conversation about doing that, we do so very thoughtfully and carefully, and you have to look at the balance of things and seeing what could come out of that. In regard to the strategy and what our plans are for busing, I'll attend the DPAC meeting and talk a little bit about that. I've mentioned it in the past, that we need to make some major moves there. We got to get off the paper. We've got to get the routing software in there. We've got to get more drivers on all these things are in motion for us. But the key to this, really, one of the keys to this is to generate some efficiency and not be planning a routing system for a bunch of students that aren't riding, so we can take care of the kids that do need to ride and do ride. So I'll get a little bit organized on that and share some thoughts so the parents are a little bit farther along in their understanding, hopefully. I just want to also mention replacement costs over time as being a significant pressure in some of our previous conversations. Over the last 5-6 years, it's been pointed out that our costs have gone from something like 1.3 million to something like 2.1 million. Is that about right, Mr. Amos? Yeah. So that's an $800,000 increase over 4, 5, 6 years. And yeah, the world's changed and we look at this stuff differently than we did, and we understand that. And we've also put more money against it, as he mentioned. And so as you build that into your previous budgets, you don't have to add it into your new budget so much, but it's still a pressure. I would like everybody to know this is one of the things that we've been talking about with our principals, with our management team, and also we've been talking about the cost of electricity, power, and heat, specifically heating. And some of the habits we got into during pandemic, open everything up. So it's a lovely thing to be able to do, but there's a cost to that. And we think that there's tens of thousands, perhaps even 100,000 or more, just going out the windows and doors, because we've gotten back into some habits of opening up, and we are heating the outside air when we don't need to be doing that. We also have some programs in place to support our staff, to communicate with our staff, to check in on our staff, and it's possible we can gain back some of that replacement cost just by managing the situation a little bit more effectively. But as we've been discussing, you can't put that in the budget until you start to see the fruits of that, right? And if you put those numbers in there and say, okay, we're going to do this and this, it's going to turn into that, we could get into trouble quite quickly. So while we're hopeful that we may get some increased enrollment, and I'll throw that back in, we don't know where they're coming from, but say we do. And let's say we do get, some funding from the government to cover exempt wages. That may happen. I'm actually a little skeptical that it will, but it might. Let's say we are able to, reduce our replacement costs and reduce our power costs, our heating costs. We may be able to, in the next conversation, have some money, hundreds of thousands of dollars to reallocate and spend on some things that we need, or put staffing back in, or what have you. But in the meantime, because all these things are pretty unknown to us, it's incumbent on us to come up with a number that we know we can manage, that we know we can hit. So that's really where we're at right now. And I don't think yes, Mr. Amos is conservative. I will vouch for him on that point. But we all need to be conservative at this particular time. I think it's an important part of our responsibility. In regard to international, we're a popular place to come. We've got a great program. It's we certainly have a lot of things that we can offer our international kids, our outdoor programs especially. But I do want to just mention that we have a very significant program for a district our size. We've got to be careful about the percentage of international kids that are in our schools, in our classrooms, and make sure that we're not saturated so that they get the best experience as well. But also, we're not really flush on space,
Yeah.
right? At the secondary, we're okay. But if you look at our capacities, you look at our projections, it would be unwise of us to continue to push more students into those spaces. It will create other pressures for us that we may not be able to handle. So the number that we're at right now, I think is not a bad spot. Program is very thriving, but I think expanding it for the purpose of adding more revenue and removing some cost pressures might lead to some other challenges. Thanks.
Thanks, Superintendent Jory. And just to tag along with the last piece of ISP, yes, many years ago, there was a push to go, but at the senior level, secondary level, we did get pushback from parents to say, you know, my child isn't able to take Math 11. You've got an international student taking up a seat. Have to be very, very careful of where the balance occurs in classroom management and enrollment management in classes, timetable building for the high schools to make sure that there's a balance. And so I think Dr. Jory's commentary or caution is well taken. And thank you very much, Angel, for your comment in the chat about the busing piece. And Dr. Jory is able to make tomorrow night's DPAC meeting to help flesh that out for parents and things like that. I think would be a valuable addition to your meeting. Education of the PAC reps from each of the schools to get the message out as best as we can. I have no further hands up or questions in the chat. And as Secretary Treasurer Amos has said, we meet again next week with a more fulsome plan of the budget and the numbers line by line. Oh, Trustee Young.
Yeah, just the last question around, because often I'll hear from people after we've passed the budget, well, how come you cut this, or how come this is not going on? And I'd like maybe Dr.
So
Jory would be willing to explain like what happens to the staffing at, you know, how it comes down to the schools and what role the schools have in deciding this. I know we might know, but other people might not.
Really, this is a great question for Ms. Wilson, who this is really her purview. And if she's willing to give a brief summation of this, then I won't be tap dancing.
Staffing.
I think I can do it, but you don't want to see me struggle live in this call.
I'm really cognizant that we're talking about people, and it's never an easy conversation when we're talking about people, and people panic with only partial information and not full information. So I'm going to talk to you respectfully in really general terms, if I may, just so that you can understand where our process is. So as our Secretary Treasurer, Mr. Amos, said, schools have got their projected enrollments, and we are cautious. We've been really careful to make sure we don't overstaff different places, because we do not want to be removing staff in September. It's a lot easier, as your chair has talked about, to add staff in September than it is to take it away. So schools currently have their learning environments, the requirements in terms of the staffing for the preparatory time, the library time, the counseling time, the learning support time. And I really want to emphasize that this board has been a board who's want to put more counseling time into our system than what we are required to do based on provincial requirements with the negotiated language. I want to ballpark it. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. I think it's about 6 FTE based on our projected enrollment that we would be required for counselors, for example, and we're sitting at about 10. We've not changed that. We've not cut that. We recognize that that's not only the right thing to be doing because of the needs, but it's the right thing to be doing because of all the conversations around mental health, anxiety, and wellness. Our learning support is really high, not really high, it's higher than the required amount, because again, we believe in supporting our teachers with the diversity that's going on in the classroom, and to be able to support classroom practices to shift, they need to have that coaching and mentoring from people who are experts in the field of being able to adapt and support the curriculums that are needed. So that's there, it's not going to change. Where we're going to see some changes is a bit here, a bit there, and they may or may not be some positions that we have to look at that are the furthest away from students. And so that's been our guiding principles that we worked with our principals and vice principals on. We've had conversation with them. You can't have this, you can't have that, you can have this, you can have that. What are we doing given the options around the overall FTE amount that we're working with? So that's really high level general terms so that I can respect individuals and not have panic out there. We're being really thoughtful about it, and we're putting children at the first and center of the decisions that we're making.
Thanks, Ms. Wilson. Trustee Kellogg.
Yeah, I just had a comment because I'm a new trustee, and seeing the budget over and over again has been so helpful for me, because immediately when I seen the budget and I seen that there was going to be some staff losses, I was very concerned about that. There was a few other things that I was concerned about, but I think the explanation, getting it more than once from Ron has been really helpful, and Assistant Superintendent Wilson also explaining that it's not a complete loss in one spot, that it'll be shared over a variety of places, and it's not a full loss. And also knowing that there's some people that are leaving the system, and so I don't think the loss is going to be, I hope those positions come back, but I just feel like I wanted to say thank you, Ron, because I have a much better understanding of the budget. And I'm sure the next time I have to look at it again, I'll have
You
even
will.
more knowledge. So thank you so much for your hard work, everybody.
Yeah, and it will happen again. And then, and really the lens in January becomes something different again, or the February amended budget becomes yet another place where you sort of see, because of, as I think Trustee Young likes to say, and Mr. Amos as well, Secretary Treasurer, this is a place in time that we know what we know, and things can shift and the ground can shift. And so we're doing our best. Our senior staff is doing the best work of where we are at this place in time. And really come September 30th, things can really look different, you know, and we take it in our stride as that. And so I have nothing in the chat, nothing, no little red or little yellow hands up. So thank you very much to all our senior staff, Secretary Amos, Ms. Wilson, Superintendent Dr. Jory, for all the hard work, and Mr. Monroe there quietly sitting and smiling, maybe having fun with his first budget with the district. And this is probably a little distant, the planes coming in and out of Toronto, and there's no snow. So it's all learning, I think, probably for him to understand how our sectoral processes go on budgets. So I thank everybody very much for this evening. We have one more step to go, and that will be next week to receive the final budget documents, to which, as Mr. Amos has said, we can approve at that time, but we have till June, and we can ask more questions. So seeing no further hands, thank you very much, everyone, for your time this evening, and we will see you next week, if not before. Some of us are going.
And just to, sorry to interrupt, but just a reminder that this will be, because it's been recorded, it will be on our website for future ponderances, I guess. Anyways, but we will, because it's recorded, we'll put it up.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Amos. Appreciate that. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Thanks, everyone.